Hi, I'm Professor Julian Agyeman, and with my colleague DEMAR Matthewes, we're going to be talking about how urban planning and design influences urban culture. Before I start, I'd like to offer a land recognition. I'm presenting to you from Cambridge, Massachusetts, on the traditional territory of the Wampanoag and the Massachusetts people. And I want to pay my respects to their elders, their past, their present, and their futures, and commit to a principle of respect and care as part of this meeting. I want to start by offering you three key thoughts on urban planning and design. The first one is a definition of urban planning that I really like. Urban planning is managing our coexistence in shared space. Key words: coexistence, shared space. These coexistences, these sharings happen whether we're thinking about environmental issues, transportation, housing, or any other urban conflicts. But the key is, we're in urban spaces. We're not dealing with everybody who looks alike, thinks alike, prays alike, makes love alike, eats alike. We are in cities of difference, places of increasing diversity, where identities are spreading in many and creative ways. How do we, as urban designers, urban planners, manage or even celebrate coexistence in shared spaces? I think the second point I'd like to make is, what's the relationship between belonging in the city and what the city can become? As urban planners, as urban designers, we're always dreaming, quite rightly, about what the city can become. It can become sustainable, smart, sharing, resilient. But what about who gets to belong? Who do we recognize as having belonging? How can we ever reconcile with people if we don't recognize their right to be in the city? How do we live with difference, diversity, and inclusion? So I want to see us as the city builders, the planners, the designers, be much more intentional about linking the notion of what the city can become with who gets to belong in the city. And finally, my shtick, if you like, is this concept of just sustainabilities, the intersecting goals of social justice and sustainability. And I want us to think about that and about cities, not as solely human scaled places, but humane scaled. I want to see humane scaled planning and design and planning that recognizes human dignity, that is empathetic, that offers a chance of reconciliation and the meeting of different human goals. So I want to give you two examples of how urban planning and design influence urban culture. And I'm going to give you examples through what I call spatial justice. How do we allocate rights in urban spaces and places? And then I want to talk a little bit about the Minneapolis paradox. How is it that one of the most green and liberal cities in the US ends up as the epicenter of our current introspection over structural racism? So let me start with spatial justice. Not many of our cities these days around the world have walls separating communities. This is Jerusalem, they do. Nicosia in Cyprus, Belfast formerly had a dividing line. But in most American cities, there is a railway track, a freeway, a creek, and on one side they live, and on the other side you live. And their lives are shorter than yours, their life expectancies shorter, their life chances are shorter. That is what we call spatial injustice. Social justice says life chances shouldn't be distributed along class lines. Spatial justice says we must not distribute opportunity and capability in a geographic sense. And yet we do. A recent Harvard University report on St. Louis said that your zip code is more important than your genetic code in determining your lifespan. We have spatially unjust communities. And I have to say, that's not by accident, that's absolutely intentional. That was part of the project. Let's come down to the level of the street. Two streets. One is Massachusetts Avenue in Cambridge, near where I live, and on the left is Södervägen in Gothenburg. Both identical width, but they look completely different. Because the ethos of each country, in Sweden, they've democratized public space, the streets, so that cyclists and walkers have as much right as the streetcar user, and to the left of the streetcar, there is a section of road that is solely for private vehicles, and you can see it's not very well used. What are the social relations on this street? Well, we know this. We know that street traffic influences social interaction. On the left is a heavily trafficked street. On the right is a lightly trafficked street. Now, you might say, well, that's interesting. Who lives in the neighborhoods with lightly trafficked streets, with bump outs, with trees, with benches? And who lives in the neighborhoods with heavily trafficked streets, where road accidents, bike accidents, pedestrian accidents are 30% higher than for the lightly trafficked middle class and upper middle class neighborhoods? But we can do this, America. We can do this. The Bloomberg administration did some really interesting stuff on streets. Bottom right, you have Broadway near Macy's. That's a people street now. We are decentering, and we need to continue decentering private vehicular travel in favor of active transportation, people who are walking and who are cycling. These pictures tell me something else, though. Planning and design should not be about what is probable, what we've probably always done. We'll never get out of this tired old paradigm if we keep doing what we've always done. Planning and design for sustainable cities must be about what is possible. You don't get the High Line, you don't get congestion charging in Stockholm, Milan, London, and hopefully New York soon. You don't get that by just thinking inside the tired paradigm. But we're also really, really, really good at creating spatial injustice. We segregate through racist infrastructures. We cut off Black communities from the downtowns, as in Oakland and in most other American cities. Part of the Biden infrastructure plan is called reconnecting communities. We can remove urban highways as racist infrastructures, and we can reconnect communities. We have to be careful, though. What do we put in place of the highway? If we just put green space, gentrification will happen. So we need to think about this. But I see highway removal as a down payment on reparations, a down payment on reparations. We also can see that we create segregation and spatial injustice through lack of infrastructures. You only have to look in lower income neighborhoods at the absence of biking infrastructure and walking infrastructures that are found in the more wealthy neighborhoods. This creates spatial injustice. On the top left, you can see studs that were placed deliberately to stop skateboarders. We put armrests to stop homeless people or underhoused people sleeping on benches. Even more egregiously, we put studs on buildings to stop the homeless sleeping there. In Seattle, bottom left, the city decided to put bike racks under a bridge where homeless people slept to get rid of the homeless people. Luckily, the good cyclists of Seattle said, whoa, not in our name, don't do that, take them up, and we need a resource-based policy on homelessness. And we have, as egregious as the rest, the rich door, poor door syndrome, where the rich people are whisked up in the elevators up to their penthouses, whereas the affordable housing people in these buildings have to go in through a back door. This is not humane planning. This is inhumane planning. My good friend Elijah Anderson at Yale University has come up with a concept he calls the cosmopolitan canopy. He says, for the most part, we wander down streets studiously trying to avoid eye contact with each other. But he said there are certain places in cities, and he calls them cosmopolitan canopies, and this is Reading Terminal Market in Philadelphia. He says where people are civil, they let down their guard, they eat something, they eat different cultural foods, they watch a ball game, they talk to each other. Cosmopolitan canopies are really important. Think about your own city. Where is the cosmopolitan canopy? Clue, food spaces are very good as cosmopolitan canopies, as are child spaces. Now, there's a theory behind this called contact theory. The more we encounter people who are different to us, the more diversity we have in our lives, the more tolerant and empathetic we become. And this goes back to some research in the late 1950s, and it holds pretty good. And I want to ask the question, and I hope it's a question that DEMAR and I can talk about later. Is there a role for planning and planners and urban designers in creating these spaces of engagement, these spaces where we are in the presence of otherness, and that's okay? Is there a role for us in creating these cosmopolitan canopies? It should be a goal of urban planning and design. So the second short presentation I want to do is looking at the other lesson from Minneapolis, urban planning as a tool of white supremacy. So on many green metrics, Minneapolis is up there with Portland, Oregon as a green city. It has the best park system in the US. It's one of the best cities for exercise with running tracks, etc. It has the third most bike commuters in the United States. It's a miracle, the miracle of Minneapolis. That's if you're white. If you're not white, it's not so good in Minneapolis. The racial inequality is among the worst in the nation. The black-white income gap is, I think, second to worst in the nation. That's what people are paid on their jobs. But most significantly, the black-white home ownership gap, the wealth gap, is way up there, and it is the highest. The Minneapolis region has the lowest level of black home ownership in the nation. Added to that is the achievement or opportunity gap in schools, which is huge between white and Native American and white and black students. So why is this? Why is Minneapolis, this model metropolis, so-called, this green metropolis at the cutting edge of urban planning? Why are there these darker truths? And what are these darker truths? Well, Kirsten Delegard, the Minneapolis historian and Mapping Prejudice Project founder, has really started to uncover some really uncomfortable data. She looked at racialized covenants. Now, before 1900, Minneapolis had a small but very well spread Black and BIPOC population. And then in the early 1900s, I think 1910 to be precise, in Minneapolis, something happened and these racialized covenants came out. This house cannot be rented or sold or otherwise let to anybody other than members of the Caucasian race. I won't go into the epithets that we use to describe which races weren't welcome, but they are horrifically racist, as you can imagine. These racial covenants, basically by the 1930s, had concentrated the black population of Minneapolis right up in North Minneapolis, where it is today. In 1917, the Supreme Court of the United States struck down racist zoning, which had been pioneered in places like Baltimore. And they thought, well, we've got to still segregate. How do we do that? We can't do it in a racist way. Hey, let's do it socioeconomically, because as we know, socioeconomics and race in the United States are pretty much a proxy for each other. So they instituted single family zoning, large lot, single family homes that cost a lot of money. And that made up 70% of the residential land in Minneapolis. And then redlining happened. The designation of certain neighborhoods redlined on a map as hazardous, and they were largely black and people of color and low-income neighborhoods. Each one of racialized covenants, single-family zoning, redlining was pretty effective at segregation. But if you consider the cumulative and synergistic effects of these three horrifically segregationist, white supremacist concepts, then you'll realize where we are. And the result is racial segregation then and now. There's only one country on earth that did it better than we've done it, and that's apartheid South Africa with the Group Areas Act. What now? They recognize, as a progressive young city council, they recognize the need to make change, to undo the past, to undo these impacts. One takeaway that I want you to think about is my quote here: urban planning is quite simply the spatial toolkit for articulating, implementing, and maintaining white supremacy, and we can do something about it. So what is Minneapolis doing about it? Well, they've got a fantastic plan called Minneapolis 2040, but before the plan began, they did away with their single family zoning. They were the first large city in the US to do away with single family zoning. Now you can have triplexes, duplexes on single family zoned land. They have an inclusionary zoning ordinance. But what I want you to look at there is the goal number one: eliminate disparities. In 2040, Minneapolis will see all communities fully thrive, regardless of race, ethnicity, gender, country of origin, religion, or zip code, having eliminated deep-rooted disparities in wealth, opportunity, housing, safety, and health. Worth taking a look at what cities are doing to try and redress past trauma. So I want to finish with just my 4 key takeaways. We need to run a racial equity lens through the hiring, theories, policies, and practices of our city building professions. We need to dismantle racist infrastructures. We need to redress the balance between belonging and becoming in the city. And we need to move towards humane-scaled, empathetic, dignified planning and design, as opposed to solely human-scaled planning and design. Thank you.
And I think one question that you raised was, how do we add this needed green space to our Black and brown neighborhoods without causing gentrification? And it seems that a lot of that onus almost has to go onto the homeowners or the people who are already living there. And that's kind of the tough part, is allowing, or what seems to be the tough part is real community say. And even these projects that come to a neighborhood from the city or wherever, that, I don't know, have intentions of doing good, but if you're only dealing with 7 to 15 people out of the local community who can have a say in this and have, you know what I mean? It's tough, because if things get green, people are coming. People are, people are moving who weren't in there.
Yeah, but the point here is, though, everybody should have these nice green neighborhoods, shouldn't they? Everybody should have nice green neighborhoods. Everybody should have access to green space. Especially, we've found out during COVID, people want open space. People want parks. People want places they can go to and have some form of recreation.
The onus always seems to kind of go to the people who live there, because they have to fight, and then they have to end up doing all this work to stay put and to add what their neighborhoods need, because they're the only ones who really know. And it's just kind of, it's strange, because I'm in the design phase, and a lot of stuff that we're doing on the architectural side is speaking to Black culture, speaking to brown culture in our designs, and trying to have the built environment speak to us more. And it's a very tough, thing, to figure out how to try to make a dent in this 100 plus years of injustice.
Well, I mean, you raise many great points there, DEMAR, and I'm aware of our time constraints, but let me just say one thing. Yes, after 100 years of failed promises, of dumping in low-income and Black neighborhoods, of redlining, of housing unaffordability and inaccessibility, of not being able to get culturally appropriate, nutritious food. I mean, the list goes on. How do we expect communities to trust those planners who come into the neighborhood and don't look like the community? They don't think like the community. They don't recognize community knowledges and expertise. And this is, I know, my architect and design friends, this is what you are trying to tap into. That's what we in the progressive urban planning community are trying to tap into. One really good example of this is the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative in Boston. In the early 1980s, this was a redlined, it was a failing neighborhood on so many ways. It was disinvested, but there was a community spirit, and a decision was made to form a neighborhood association, the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative. But before they set up the organization, they did a demographic survey of the Roxbury Dudley area, and they constituted the board of directors to look like the community. And to this day, 40 years on, it still does. They're still the only US nonprofits who've been given eminent domain status by the city of Boston. They built hundreds of affordable homes. They created a couple of community land trusts where there are now urban farms, both commercial and nonprofit, that supply local food co-ops. The list goes on. They are hugely creative, hugely trusted by the local community, and loved by the foundations and the city because they have traction, they have trust. So the question I always ask is, you know, if your organization, planning department, design department, doesn't look like the community, are you trusted? Are you effective? Can you even do your job? Or are you seen as that white savior complex person coming in with all the best intentions in the world, but not trusted fully because they're not tried and tested by the community? So I really absolutely agree. And this is why in one of my takeaways, I said we need to look at the policies, practices, hiring practices as well of our design and planning organizations.
Yeah, I think that a lot of us as designers, urban planners, et cetera, people in this kind of creative field that has to do with the built environment, in today's age, we're kind of taking more action in a sense. I know from people in my group, and I'm only 2 years out of school, we're okay to do things that may not be illegal, or I mean, that may not be legal if it benefits our community, you know, to try and put in a little park or put in some benches that will allow homeless people to sit, you know, and to rest. And I think that it starts with our little grassroots methods. And I think once the conversations get a little more, I don't know, I don't think that urban planners and architects work together as well as we can quite yet.
Totally. And you know, DEMAR, you know, good on your generation. You know, my generation would sit around for hours, weeks, days, discussing tactics, strategy, and everything. You guys, you invented pop-up urbanism, guerrilla gardens, parking day, all of these pop-up events. Food trucks are part of that. This new exciting urbanism that is instantaneous. And that's really exciting. And I think, you know, when I think about it, you know, which city council is going to rip up plants that have been put by the local community in a median, in a road that was formerly littered? It would be silly to do that. One thing I do want to get into this is the idea of co-production. And I'm thinking about a park now. A park has to be designed, managed, and programmed. And often that design, management, and programming is done by people from outside the community who don't look like the community. They might have come from the suburbs. What if we co-designed, co-managed, and co-programmed parks? I've actually got a student doing some research on this. Imagine if the community was fully involved in the design of the park and then in the management and maintenance where possible, and I'm thinking of health and safety issues, but certainly in the programming of the park. Would that not be a better park? Would it not be more a space of engagement? Would it not be a place where people could come together across difference and enjoy being in each other's company? So I want to see more co-production, and I can see both the urban planning and urban design fields as being ripe for co-production that recognizes community knowledges, community expertise, and communities wanting to do something to make them feel that they belong.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, that's exactly the kind of thing that we've been doing. Right now, we're in the process of doing that exact thing. So we kind of have phased out this piece of land in South Central. I'm trying not to be too specific so I don't get caught. But we kind of went and planted a seed. Really, it was 200 or so seeds for different fruits and vegetables. And it was just the first part of the park. And we wanted to have people see us be there every day, who are just driving by, who walk by and live there. And then after a while, you know, it started to be people coming up, talking to us. ask them what we're doing, how to get involved. And then it started to just kind of grow. And now we're moving on to our second phase. And now we're having, artists come in who did the graffiti that was over there before, and now they're going to do a different type of piece, and this thought process of now we're trying to put 1,000 different plants just in this small little area and have place for people to just sit, that the community is already taken care of. Like this community organization, WLCAC, has already been taken care of, and we're just kind of taking from their lead and trying to move it forward in a different way. So yeah, we're very interested in that exact thing, and hopefully I can let you know how it plays out.
I'd be happy to, but for the people in the audience, let's think about co-production. Let's think about the recognition of expertise and desire and drive and knowledge from communities. I mean, recently I was in San Diego, and a colleague from San Diego State took me to Chicano Park, which is in Barrio Logan. It's underneath a kind of tangle of freeways, and so that's not a good place for a park. But what the Mexican-American community have done with this fantastic space, the art, the motifs and memorials that are placed in memory of people, the paintings, and the place is so clean. The community really wants that. Now, I haven't fully researched it, but I can only believe that there must be some agreement between the community and the city about how this space is used and managed. And that's got to be the way forward. It's got to be a co-production approach, a collaborative approach, where there's an equal partnership and an equal will to see success in these projects.
I cannot agree more. And you see them, I mean, I start to notice them more and more, maybe the last 2 years or so, 3 years, where you just see these little gems in a neighborhood that nobody else is really gonna know about, besides the immediate community who had a say in that. Yeah. And I don't know, it's interesting. I think the idea of more of these kind of creating a little node or nodes in, my part of town, South Central, that all speak to each other in a sense, is a very interesting thing, and for that to expand.
Exactly, yeah, from like little seeds, and I mean the idea of them speaking to each other, or the idea of them joining up, that these little islands of good practice become not good practice, but normal practice. I mean, not only are we doing these projects, I think, DEMAR, but we are demonstrating that this can be done. And your work, it sounds like, it's growing as more people see it, as more people think through what you're doing. And that's a fantastic thing. We need to demonstrate that there is a different way forward. Social justice never simply happens in urban planning. It's always been a desirable, but often secondary goal to economic or environmental or technical issues. The events of the last couple of years here in the United States have shown us social justice and equity must become the central goals of urban planning, not desirable but second order goals. We don't get to social justice and sustainability unless we put social justice and sustainability at the core of our decision making.
Yeah, I can agree more. I think that, of course, it's going to be a marathon, not a sprint, and it's going to hopefully be something that we see constantly increasing, and I don't know, that it's a tangible difference in the built environment soon to come, hopefully.
And it's a journey. You say a marathon, not a sprint. Yes, but it's a journey rather than a destination. The destination will always elude us, but being on the journey, we are going to move towards more socially just, more sustainable communities. But as we get closer, notions of social justice and sustainable cities will change. And so we'll have a little bit further to go, but we have to be on the journey. And it is a marathon, it isn't a sprint.
Well, I guess in closing, Julian, would you like to say where people can find more about your work and I'll also do the same.
Yeah. If you just Google me, Julian Agyeman, or you go to the Tufts University website and put my name in, you can find me. And yeah, I've got a pretty informative website at julianagyeman.com. Looking forward to speaking to some of you.
I'm a little harder to find than Julian. Julian has a picture when you Google him, but you can go to offtopdesign.com, offtopdesign on Instagram, LinkedIn, etc. Or you can still Google. I'm sure there's a few articles that'll come up. But yes, also looking forward to hopefully continue conversation with both Julian and anyone who would like to speak further after this.
Great. Thanks, DEMAR.
Thank you. I appreciate it.